Hey, Culpeper Presbyterian family. This is week 6 of our current sermon series, Your Home Spiritual Workout. This is a series that closely aligns with our new church mission to be disciples together, because in truth, you cannot be a disciple without a commitment to your own personal spirituality. All of your service, all of your ministry, all of your engagement with others in the life of the church and outside of it flows from that center of your own personal spiritual life. In order to be a disciple, you have to cultivate your own personal spirituality. So this week, let's start with a selection of verses from the Old Testament book of Ecclesiastes. These verses are included in the email that contains the link to this sermon. So if you want to follow along, you can. Many people really enjoy the book of Ecclesiastes in the Old Testament and also its sister book, Proverbs, because it tells you about life both accurately and unapologetically. It really does speak truth in a stark, real way to our own experience. So, here are 4 selections from the book of Ecclesiastes that have something in common. First, chapter 4, verse 6 reads, "Better is a handful with quiet than 2 handfuls with toil, which is a chasing after the wind." Better to have less if you can be at peace with it, than to have more if it requires you living a life of labor and toil, which in the end, Solomon says, is vain. It's like chasing after the wind. You cannot catch it. Next, this is chapter 5, verse 12. "Sweet is the sleep of the day laborer, whether they eat little or much, but the plenty of the rich will not let them sleep." So the more you have, the harder you work, the more responsibilities are piled upon your shoulder, the harder it is to find peace of mind. Been there? I certainly resonate with that verse too. Next, we have chapter 6, verses 7 and 8. "All human work is for our mouths to eat and to speak about our accomplishments. And yet, our appetite for both is never satisfied. And this seems to afflict the wise and the foolish equally." So all that we do in our lives are for us to be provided for, that is, to eat with our mouths, and for us to be able to be valued and have recognition, that is, so that we can speak about our accomplishments. And yet what Solomon identifies is that our appetite for our work or being busy and what it brings us is never satisfied. And this crosses all socioeconomic lines. The poor and the rich alike, the wise and the fools alike, are never satisfied with how much they're working and how much they're getting from their work. And last, this is chapter 8, verses 16 and 17. "When I applied my mind to know wisdom and to understand everything done on this earth, my eyes could no longer sleep day or night. Only God can grasp all that happens under the sun. However much we may toil in our seeking, we will not find it out, not even the wisest among us." So no matter how much information we seek to gather on any given subject, no matter how much we want to understand anything, something, Solomon says there is no end to that pursuit. Only God understands fully, and yet we foolishly think that we can. What those 4 passages and others like them in Ecclesiastes are describing is what psychologists in our day call the disease of more. Psychologists also call the same phenomenon the hedonic treadmill. Hedonic coming from the word hedonism. The idea being that you cannot experience enough, know enough, work enough, be busy enough, or be entertained enough, be involved enough that you don't just want a little more, or what's next around the corner. And so the treadmill continues and continues until we exhaust ourselves and collapse. This is the disease of more. There's a great pop psychologist, cultural writer of our day by the name of Mark Manson, who describes this phenomenon in our culture as it pertains to just simply all of the opportunities that you and I have and the cost of us having all of those opportunities. He writes, I quote, "But here's the problem. Modern society multiplies our opportunities. Therefore, modern society also multiplies our opportunity costs, making it costlier and more difficult to commit all of our time and energy to any one thing without feeling some form of remorse or regret. Enter the concept of FOMO, or fear of missing out. We live a life that is constantly pelted with reminders of everything we are unable to become. What's changed is not our inability to manage our time or balance our lives between work and play. What's changed is that we have more opportunities for work and play than ever before. More interest, more awareness of every possible experience we've been passing up. In short, we have more opportunity cost. When we attempt to do everything, to fill up life's checklist, to have it all, we are essentially attempting to live a valueless life. A life where everything is equally gained and nothing lost. And when everything is necessary and desired equally, then nothing is necessary or desired at all." That's an apt description of the way that many of us in the 21st century live and sometimes aren't 100% aware. We are all afflicted with the disease of more. Wanting to do more, wanting to become more, wanting to be more involved, wanting the next new thing. This is the hedonic treadmill, the disease of more. There's a well-known Christian writer on the spiritual life whose writings were probably most popular in the early 20th century by the name of Evelyn Underhill, who in just 2 sentences describes this human affliction well. Quote, "We mostly live our lives conjugating 3 verbs, to want, to have, and to do. Craving, clutching, and fussing, we are kept at perpetual unrest." Ecclesiastes was written 3,000 years ago, and yet those verses seem as if they were written about 21st century America. That's because somehow written into human DNA is this disease of more. And as she puts it, our craving, our clutching, and all of our fussing simply adds up to keeping us at perpetual unrest. So if that's the problem, if that's an accurate diagnosis of one of the afflictions that you and I live with every day, what's the solution? Well, the solution has to do with spiritual habits and disciplines for the Christian. But in order for me to talk about those specific habits or disciplines, we need to back up one step and talk about the binary difference between 2 sets of spiritual disciplines and how they work. So, For starters, surely you've heard somewhere that most errors or missteps that we make as people, sins you could call them, can be broken down into two classifications. There is the sins of omission and the sins of commission. Sins of omission are simply things that we do not do, but we ought to. If you will, they're sins of under-engagement. Then there are sins of commission. Sins where you do something actively that you wish you didn't. Or in the case of today's topic, where you do too much of something to your detriment. If you will, they're sins of over-engagement. Now here's the thing. If you're struggling with a problem of omission, then you need to develop spiritual habits of engagement. If your problem is that you're not doing something to the degree or the level that you want, a spiritual discipline of engagement will help. For example, if you feel like you don't have any deep friendships, someone who knows you soul to soul, that's a problem of omission. It's a lack. The only thing that's going to correct that is you taking active steps to develop that kind of relationship. So you work on the spiritual discipline of friendship, or perhaps community in the form of joining a small group or a Sunday school class, or doing a ministry with somebody and then practicing the spiritual discipline of hospitality and asking someone to come over to your house so you can begin to build a relationship with them. See how it works? If it's a problem of omission and not doing, then you use a spiritual discipline of doing or engagement to address it. Well, in our case today, we're talking about a problem of commission, the disease of more, of never being satisfied and filling our lives to the brim, so much so that we're at perpetual unrest. Well, the only way to address a problem of commission or more is through a spiritual habit or two of disengagement, what Dallas Willard calls the spiritual disciplines of abstinence, what historically have been called the spiritual disciplines of asceticism, built off the word ascetic, A-S-C-E-T-I-C. This is where you take things away from your life so that you can deal with your more problem. Let me give you another word for spiritual disciplines of disengagement, and it's the word subtraction. One of the great medieval Christian thinkers is someone named Meister Eckhart, and he says this brilliantly in one sentence. Quote, God is not found in the soul by adding anything, but by a process of subtraction. If you want to find God, especially in this age of more and perpetual unrest, the way to do it is to subtract things from your life. The great writer on spirituality in our day, Richard Rohr, expands upon what Meister Eckhart says this way. Quote, Meister Eckhart rightly pointed out that spirituality has much more to do with subtraction than it does with addition. I am sad to say that most spirituality in the West has largely become a matter of addition. This spiritual consumerism focuses on learning more spiritual ideas, earning merit badges from God, trying to attain our own enlightenment, and having the willpower for heroic moral behavior and service. Yet, the counterintuitive nature of the Jesus journey shows it is not at all about getting, attaining, achieving, performing, or succeeding, all of which tend to pander to our egos. Instead, Jesus' spirituality is much more about letting go of what we do not need anyway. If you and I are going to live well as Christian people, in this age in particular, in this culture in particular, that is afflicted by the disease of more, we need to begin to weave into our own spiritual lives disciplines or habits of disengagement, subtraction, if you will. That's how we're going to spend the next 2 weeks. Today, I'm going to finish by talking briefly about 2 spiritual habits of disengagement. Then we're going to come back next week and I'm going to talk about another one and develop it pretty fully. Now, don't worry, I'm going to hit these 2 that I present today pretty quickly, but in the Monday email, I'll develop them more and I'll help you figure out how to try them out this week in your own life. So the first spiritual discipline of disengagement or subtraction that works against our disease of more is something that we call fasting. Now, often if you've heard fasting discussed, it has to do primarily with food, but it doesn't have to be that specific. It can be the purposeful removal of anything that you struggle to do too much or have too much. I want you to listen to how one writer on spiritual disciplines by the name of Adele Aylberg Calhoun describes fasting. Quote, "Fasting is not a magical way to manipulate God into doing our will. It is not a way to get God to be an accomplice to our plans. Fasting clears us out and opens us up to intentionally seeking God's will and grace in a way that goes beyond normal habits of worship and prayer. Fasting is an opportunity." Now, this sentence is key to understanding what fasting is. Fasting is an opportunity to lay down an appetite for food, for TV, for the internet, for shopping, for anything really. This act of self-denial may not seem huge. It's just missing a meal or 2 or ignoring your phone. But it brings us face to face with the hunger at the core of our being. Fasting exposes how we try to keep our hunger at bay and gain a sense of well-being by devouring our creature comforts. Through self-denial, we begin to recognize what controls us. This truth is not meant to discourage us. It's simply the first step in realizing that we have to lay down our life in order to find it again in God. Fasting. There are probably things in your life that you struggle to have too much of. Too much busyness, too much screen time, too much food, and on the list can go. And so, a Christian way of building a spiritual life that addresses this disease of more is to fast periodically. All American people who have a smartphone, for example, probably ought to have a period or 2 a week where they don't look at it, where they are not addicted to the pings, the bings, the rings of that little cyber tyrant. That's what fasting would look like from the internet, from your device. Now, the second spiritual discipline of disengagement or subtraction that we're going to talk about actually dovetails with the first. In fact, it can be a place where you practice your fasting, if you like. The second spiritual discipline of subtraction that works well for those of us afflicted with the disease of more is Sabbath. Here's how the Sabbath is described in Exodus chapter 20, verses 8 to 11. These verses are also included in the email that has the sermon link. Quote, "Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you nor your sons or daughters, nor your male or female servants, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them. But he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Now those are the verses, but I want you to hear how Dallas Willard describes God's purpose in giving us the Sabbath. Dallas Willard writes, "The Sabbath, Jesus told us in Mark 2:27, was made for man. That is, it serves human life in essential ways. Without it, life cannot be what it should be. It is not something that we have to do because God arbitrarily required it of us, a pointless hoop he would have us jump through. No, it is his gift to us. Sabbath is a way of life. It sets us free from bondage to our own efforts. Sabbath should be holy, we read. What that means is you need to have a day or part of a day every week that is distinct from every other day or part of the day that you have during the rest of the week. You need to have something that feels set apart in your life, a period of time where you don't do the things that you usually do. All these things that define the disease of more. Where you're not going to watch TV as much. You're not going to surf the internet as much. You're not going to consume news as much. And you choose instead to set it aside to have this special time each week that is a Sabbath. So if you struggle with filling your to-do list, with errands to run, or with working in the yard, or other items on your to-do list, set aside a period of time every week, a day or part of the day, where you don't do that. And where, in fact, you lift to the fore things that you wish you could be doing, but you often struggle to find time to do. So, for example, last week we talked about purposeful remembering in your spiritual life. Maybe you will have a Sabbath period or a Sabbath day during the week where you journal a little bit, where you do that purposeful remembering, because it's so easy for that to get set aside in the rush of your days and the flow of your shopping or your work. Maybe you'll use part of your Sabbath period, part of your Sabbath day to fast, to go back to the first spiritual discipline of disengagement, where you're not going to watch TV for 3 or 4 hours in the afternoon, where you're going to turn off your phone and put your attention onto other things, where you're going to take a walk in the woods, where you're going to eat with your family and nobody is looking at a screen. This is what a Sabbath can look like in your life. It is a special time set apart that God made and intended for you, for us to flourish as human beings. It's his gift to us. So this week, we begin our 2-week exploration of the key spiritual principle that in order to add, you have to subtract. And especially in this age that is afflicted with so much to do, so much busyness, so many opportunities that we feel like we're missing out, so many ways to entertain ourselves, we choose instead spiritual habits of disengagement. And in so doing, we realize that all that stuff was not where we were going to find real life and real meaning and real joy anyway. Those are properties that only come from our engagement with God. So this week, let's just see if we subtract a little bit from our lives, if God doesn't add back tenfold. Will you pray with me? Father in heaven, thank you for the wisdom of our forefathers in the faith that teach us that so often we fill our lives to bursting and pay a heavy price when we do. So this week, help us experiment with spiritual habits of simplicity that teach us to subtract so that we can add you and what really matters to our lives. Father, this is scary. For some of us, we've never done this before. So we pray that you meet us more than halfway in our feeble attempts to put into practice this timeless spiritual wisdom. And we ask this for your sake and ours. Amen.